of South Africa, which is equivalent to the ambassador in Canada. We will be joining us, and we will be doing a movie screening of Roadmap to Apartheid afterwards. While we wait for the High Commissioner, we can start our program today, and we will start with the land acknowledgement. Elizabeth, if you can start us off.
As we are meeting on the traditional and unceded territory of many Indigenous nations and peoples, Canada is built on the theft of these territories as much as the exploitation of workers. From the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for over a century, the central goals of Canada's Aboriginal policy were to eliminate Aboriginal governments, ignore Aboriginal rights, terminate the treaties, and through a process of assimilation, cause Aboriginal peoples to cease to exist as distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities in Canada. The establishment and operation of residential schools were a central element of this policy, which can best be described as cultural genocide. To further reconciliation means acknowledging genocide and taking action to end colonialism.
This is just a list of the First Nations in Ontario, because we are coming from virtually in different parts of Ontario, and a list of the rest of the First Nations in Northern Ontario. Next, before we start, we have our statement of respect. Harassment and discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated at OPSEU SEFPO functions. Whenever OPSEU SEFPO members gather, we welcome all peoples of the world. We will not accept any unwelcoming words, actions, or behaviors against our union members. We accord and respect all persons, regardless of age, creed, political affiliation, and racialization, including and not limited to people of African descent, Black, Caribbean, South Asian, Asian, women, men, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Members of ethno-racial groups, peoples with disabilities, gays, lesbian, bisexual, trans, two-spirit, and gender diverse persons. Francophones and all other persons whose first language is not English. In our diversity, we build our solidarity as union members. If you believe that you are being harassed or discriminated against, please contact our equity staff members, Hilda Namu or Matthew De Silva, for immediate assistance. Just a few quick introductions before we introduce our honorable guests. My name is Ala Qadi. I am the Vice Chair of OPSEU's Coalition of Racialized Workers. I am from Region 4. We also have with us Elizabeth Ha, who's the other Vice Chair of Coalition of Racialized Workers from Region 1. We also have a couple of members from the Rainbow Alliance, who just had some technical problems. Rob Boulay, actually 3 members. From Region 6, and Christian Wright from Region 4, and Tina Olet from Region 4. Our OPSEU staff members with us are Hilda Namu and Matthew De Silva. And now it is my honor to welcome High Commissioner, His Excellency Rieaz Shaik. High Commissioner Rieaz Shaik, known as Mo, has been South Africa's envoy to Canada for just over 2 years. Mr. Shaik is an anti-apartheid activist, a former student leader, an active member of the African National Congress. He was also a negotiator in the Convention for the Democratic South Africa, CODESA, the multi-party talks, and played a significant role in shaping intelligent dispensation for democratic South Africa. Mr. Shaik has held several senior management positions, both in the private and public sectors. His various positions included head of Department of Optometry at the University of Durban Westville, CEO of Corba Africa, Pty Limited, Deputy Intelligence Coordinator, South Africa's Consul General to Germany, South Africa's Ambassador to Democratic Republic of Algeria, Special Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the head of South Africa's Foreign Intelligence Service, and Group Executive of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Mr. Shaik is also an author of the ANC Spy Bible, Surviving Across Enemy Lies, a memoir published in 2020. High Commissioner Shaik is an outspoken thought leader, ever ready to be engaged in the exchange of ideas and shape the trajectory of his own country. I have listened to Mr. Shaik a couple of times before, and I was so impressed. OPSEU is so honored to have you, Mr. Shaik. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much. I just want to check a sound check. Can everyone hear me loud and clear?
Loud and clear.
So I should just inform you that I am coming from the Senate, in which the Senate of Canada want to debate with a group of ambassadors about Canada's Africa strategy. And I thought that in my intervention there, it would be important that we call on Canada to recognize Palestine as a state. And we do so because we think that if any solution to the Middle East is going to happen, and of course we all know that the Middle East is in an enormous spiral of destruction at the moment, that any solution has to start with the recognition of Palestine as a state. Of course, this matter of Palestine as a state is not an easy one, especially in Canada. But yet, amongst all the people who have been colonized and all the people who have a history of struggling against colonialism, will understand the importance of recognizing Palestine as a state. The second issue I want to raise, Ala, is that what is happening in the Middle East right now is incredibly frightening, not only for the destruction that is taking place in that part of the world, not only because we see the genocide happening against the Palestinian people, but a very other important issue is happening. And what we are now seeing is the breakdown of international law and the impunity of states to support the violations of international law. And it is in this regard, we are also very concerned that because of the rapid breakdown of international law taking place, that we are spiraling the world into a crisis that may lead to further conflict and further destruction of the world. So when we brought the matter before the ICJ, we were very, very clear that the issue, on the one hand, yes, we want to prevent the genocide against the Palestinians. And you see, I do not hesitate to use that word genocide. It is genocide against the Palestinians, but also because we were deeply concerned that the conduct of the state of Israel and the conduct by other states in supporting Israel in what they're doing were leading to the breakdown of the international law. And when I say international law, I do not refer to this term called the rule-based international order, whose rules we do not understand and whose order we don't understand. We understand the international legal system as reflected in the United Nations as the means in which we have all voluntarily subscribed to and by which we have accepted that we have certain laws by which we would abide to in respect of the world. Now, in regard to the matter, in regard to the matter that we brought before the ICJ, well, we relied on certain provisions of the law, which is referred to as erga omnes, where we have, as a signatory to the convention of the ICJ and to the Genocide Convention. We as a country who's a signatory to that convention has an obligation to uphold that convention. And we believe that the actions of the State of Israel was indeed, in our opinion, engaged in the crime of genocide. And, many people are confused about the definition of genocide. So I'm going to quote to you from the actual Article 2 of the Convention, and then we can leave it to ourselves to determine whether genocide is happening or not, simply by the definition. So in terms of Article 2 of the Convention, genocide means, and I quote, any one of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, by killing members of the group, 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, 4, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, just by the simple definition that the court is dealing with, we can all agree that what indeed is happening is genocide. Nowhere there in the definition do you see that all of this does not apply in the name of the right to self-defense. So in the right to self-defense, you cannot do any of the things that I've just argued and claim that your right to self-defense negates the Genocide Convention. And besides that, we have submitted evidence, irrefutable evidence, that illuminates the applicability of the convention to Israel as a contracting party to the convention. Now, we want to say upfront that by holding Israel to account for its action, that is neither anti-Semitic nor anti-Jewish racism, and we reject those spurious charges as nonsense. And whoever tells me that, I tell them you are speaking nonsense, and they can literally, in my opinion, go to hell when they raise that kind of argument. Fourthly, Israel is a signatory to the convention. Israel, by the articles of the convention, has pledged that Israel is committed, either in times of peace or in times of war, to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. Now, none of that is being applied. And here's the most important thing, in my opinion, that the convention makes no exception for the state of Israel, and Israel has no special status in the convention that allows it not to be held accountable for its violations. So why did we pursue the matter? We pursued the matter because, firstly, for us, international law matters, and it seriously matters. And now we are seeing that because we did not hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law, that has led to impunity, where we have a situation today, as we speak, where Israeli tanks are rolling into Syria, again, a violation of another sovereign. And this is just simply unacceptable things that are happening in the world, which will encourage other states to engage in acts of impunity that violates the international legal system that we all say we hold very dearly to. Now, we are not going to stop. South Africa is not going to stop in its attempts to hold Israel accountable, now more than ever, because we see if this impunity does not stop, then I'm afraid to tell you that the world we're going to live in tomorrow and the day after is going to be rather worse than the world we're living in today. So for the sake of international order, for the sake of holding all human beings accountable to a set of values, we have decided that this matter we will pursue to the end. And of course, we will remind every other signatory to the convention of their responsibilities in respect to the convention. Now, this brings me perhaps to my last point, and I would take many of the questions that you would ask, that it is true that we are in the week of the 11th year of Nelson Mandela's passing. And Nelson Mandela is a leader, and if you really ask yourself, why do we indeed love him so much? Not only in South Africa, but all over the world. Well, firstly, he was a person who time and time again led our struggle to the great heights that we have achieved. And he was always there, and he was always equal to the task. Whatever the situation demanded, he was equal to the task. If the task was to spend a lifetime in prison, he was willing to do so in order to keep our struggle alive. But yet the day he came out from prison, he embraced reconciliation. He embraced reconciliation with people who were his enemies. But his reconciliation was not a weakness, it was a strength. His reconciliation was such that in every forum that he went to, he would argue very strongly for the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. When he was under pressure by the United States of America to abandon Arafat, to abandon Fidel Castro, he was quite clear that he is not going to do that. And reconciliation does not mean you abandon the principles by which all of us must live. So in that regard, we are keeping the spirit of Mandela alive, because he would demand this from us, that we continue the case of freedom, because it is indeed true. Our freedom in South Africa is incomplete if the Palestinians are not free. Canadians are not free if the Palestinians are not free. No citizen in the world can be free, truly free, if another citizen of the world is under oppression or kept under conditions of apartheid. And that brings me, and I must say, I will stop here, Allah. You know, I have heard many people in Canada want to tell me that what is happening in Israel is not apartheid. Well, here's the funny thing. Those who have not lived in apartheid will be the first to tell you what is apartheid and what is not apartheid. They never ask the people who actually live in apartheid, who struggled against apartheid, what is apartheid? Well, we know apartheid. We smell it, we see it, we know it, we feel it, we can touch it. And when we say that that is apartheid, we do not make that accusation lightly, because we know what apartheid is. And what is happening in Israel? Israel is an apartheid state, and the same action that was taken against apartheid South Africa must be taken against apartheid Israel in every forum. And no one can justify apartheid. It is a crime against humanity, as apartheid was a crime against humanity. And I really wish that the West in particular can start to deal with their double standards, because in many ways they shame us. They shame us. They say that what we went through was apartheid, but what the Palestinians are going through is not apartheid. And yet we, the victims of apartheid, will say what the Palestinians are going through is apartheid. So I really believe that civil society, your union, in particular, other unions, need to join the rally that says, the end of apartheid Israel must start with us. It must start with us. This is the requirement of any conscious human being alive in 2024. None of us can escape this responsibility, this duty to keep flying the flag of free Palestine. Thank you very much, Allah. I would take your questions as they come, or
Thank you so much, Mr. Shaik. And just for our audience, because of the limited time, we had calls within the organizing committees from Coalition of Racialized Workers and Rainbow Alliance. So we have a few questions here. Elizabeth, could you start us by reading the first question from the slide in front of you?
Okay, the first question is, what was the unions in South Africa? What were they doing in their part in fighting apartheid? And what can unions in Canada learn from the unions in South Africa during the apartheid to help fight and support the people around the world to fight against oppression, apartheid, racism, occupation, and colonization?
that's a very, very good question. But let me just locate it in some kind of historical context. Firstly, I want to say, and I want to thank the unions of Canada, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union has been a union that supported the anti-apartheid struggle. So did Coupe, so did others. So the unions of Canada were a very important instrument and cog into the anti-apartheid struggle of South Africa. And the unions in South Africa came to the understanding that workers' rights in South Africa is intrinsically linked to the political rights that they have or did not have at the time as citizens of the country. So the unions had the choice in one way to fight for workers' issues, but they linked those worker issues to the anti-apartheid struggle because fundamentally they knew that no worker could truly be free in an apartheid society. So the strategy of the unions in South African anti-apartheid struggle was to be part of the broad democratic movement, and the broad democratic movement had the objective of bringing down the regime of apartheid, and the unions were very instrumental in that struggle. Now, if we can see the kind of linkages or the possible lessons we could learn in this regard, I think unions are the basis of consciousness. Unions are the place in which we develop a consciousness, both of the class consciousness in terms of the issues we grapple with as a class, the workers' class, but more importantly, the political consciousness that shapes the dynamics within the worker community. So in this regard, the Palestinian issue matters. I would think that the unions should be taking up that struggle. They should be linking with other unions in the world. And you know, we always had the slogan in our days, workers of the world unite. Well, unions of the world unite, and unite around the Free Palestine movement, ensure that whatever you do leads to the end of occupation. And I think that's a very important thing. I'll just give you an example. Union workers in Canada refused to deal with any goods that was designed or on destination, either coming from or going to South Africa. Union workers did that. And when the union workers of Canada stopped dealing with goods that were going to apartheid South Africa or dealing with goods that came from apartheid South Africa had to take notice that this indeed was a momentum that was developing and spread around the world. Well, you can go and figure as a diplomat, I can't specifically tell you what I want to tell you, but you could gather from that if indeed at the end of the day, if the United Nations take sanctions against Israel for what for its genocidal activities or for its impunity, then this is something that your union should be thinking about.
Ina, can you ask the second question?
Hello, and thank you for being with us. So at a time when the West supported the apartheid regime in South Africa, could you tell us more about your life within the African National Congress at that time and give examples of what the repression tactics used by the colonization apartheid government, what they would have looked like, and how the ANC and the people of South Africa fought back?
These are deeply emotional questions for me, and I'm a highly sensitive human being, so I choke easily. And if I do choke, forgive me. I joined the ANC as a rather young person. I think I was 16 years old at the time. And in South Africa, I must say it was difficult not to join the anti-apartheid struggle, because apartheid was so very much in your face. Now, let me just explain, because many people do not know what apartheid is. And they would just simply think that apartheid was a system that didn't allow Black people to vote. And by the way, if any one of you wondering, I am classified as Black. I identify as Black. I have been Black all my life in regard to the political choices I make. So when I refer to apartheid, you got to understand that from cradle to grave, races and national groups in South Africa were separated. And of course, the separation is what we call internal colonialism of a special kind, because we were separated, Black people were separated, indigenous African people were separated from the so-called colored people, so-called South Africans of Indian extraction, and each had various levels of development. Each had various levels of development. But the first time I spoke to a white person was when I was maybe 18 years old, when I went to university, and I had to have a permit for this particular university. It was an Indian university for Indian people. I was classified as colored, or otherwise you would know as Métis, and I needed a permit to study there. So apartheid life, from the very beginning of your birth to the time you die, determined where you live, what access you would have, what kind of schooling you'll go through, which university. It shaped everything, everything. But the economic relationship of apartheid was that people of color existed simply as a supply of labor to people, to white people in South Africa. So you got to understand there was a constant transfer of wealth from Black people to white people. And this is why we call it internal colonialism of a special kind. Now, so apartheid was more than just not having the vote. It was a structured system of underdevelopment. And of course, many of the challenges we face today in South Africa is that we are dealing with the legacy of apartheid, whether it is underdevelopment, whether it is poverty, whether it is inequality. And don't get me wrong, the government that I belong to and the government that has been in government in place for the past 30 years, we made a terrible mess of things. We became too arrogant. We became too distant from the people who we needed to serve. And yeah, we got punished in the last election, and which is a good wake-up call for the ANC to start renewing itself, to go back to the people that once made it a very proud organization. But there are much lessons from there. So when we say that what we see in Israel and the relationship that Israel have with either its Arab citizens or with Palestine those are all colonial relationships. They are colonial relationships. They are there simply to extract wealth. There is fundamentally no development of the Palestinian people, and whatever development that was done by international support has now been destroyed in this genocidal war. So the consequences in Israel and for the Palestinian people are going to live on for generations. And I'm just hoping that a solution can be found so that this could be resolved, and resolved quickly, because its generational damage has already occurred there. So, and we know that because we are now 30 years free, but still the ghost and the legacy and the incredible baggage of apartheid exist in South Africa. And it is there as a fault line that can explode at any particular time. But we've got to, as a government, manage that. And sometimes we do it well, and sometimes, most times, we do it terribly wrong. Oh, I didn't tell you about myself, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
So I joined the ANC at a young age. I was declared a terrorist. I was detained for about 10 months in solitary confinement. That is where I lost my little bit of my sanity, but I came out all the better for it. I traveled, I was smuggled out the country. I got trained in the GDR. I was smuggled back into the country. I did get involved in the military operations. And then eventually I was brought into the negotiation process. And that is where I became a true believer in negotiations. I'm sorry, I can't, I just have a difficult speaking about myself. So sorry.
It's okay. We can, thank you very much for sharing that with us. The next question. The Bantustan system is the system that the apartheid government created to have different homelands for Black indigenous people of South Africa and force this majority of people into a small part of South Africa. Shamefully, the apartheid government took that system from the First Nations reservations here in Canada. First, can you tell us more about the Bantustan system? And do you have any comments on the Canadian role during the 50s, 60s, and 70s in supporting South African apartheid?
Yes, so let's just start. Often there is the pride that the Canadian government or Canadian people generally have, that they were not a colonizing power, in the sense that Canada never had a colony. And I think that is true, that Canada did not have a colony outside of Canada. I think inside of Canada, I think there really has to be a much more engaging discussion about settler colonialism and the consequences of settler colonialism in Canada. It is not for nothing. And if you read Tanya Talaga's books, and I'm now going through a book called Knowing, and if you look at the socioeconomic indicators of Indigenous people in Canada, well, they actually mirror the social economic indicators in South Africa in respect of how our Indigenous people were left behind by internal colonialism. And I think there is a similarity here, that the whole process of genuine reconciliation has not occurred in Canada. And I can understand it. It seems to be a difficult, it's a crucial conversation where the stakes are high, there are different emotions, there are different views on the matter, and of course it's a highly emotive discussion. But we took strength from the fact that we could have those difficult discussions, because without having those discussions, you would not be able to move on as a society. You will not be able to move on. You will always have this invisibility. And the truth of the matter is, Indigenous people are invisible in Canada. They're invisible. The only Indigenous people you'll see are the poor and the marginalized at stations. And no one asks the question why this is the case and what needs to be done to fundamentally change that. Now, it is true that Canada benefited from the colonial system of the British in Africa. Well, it certainly was part of the British colonialist system in South Africa when there was what we call the white man's war between the British and the Boers at the time. And Canada sent 7,000 of its citizens to go and fight on the side of the British against the Afrikaner people in South Africa. It was then called the Anglo-Boer War. It's now called the South African War. And this is the reason why you have the Pretoria Bridge in Ottawa. You have the Pretoria Bridge in Ottawa because Canadians fought in the Anglo-Boer War, or now the South African War. It may come as a surprise to you that there are cemeteries, memorials in South Africa that the South African government takes care of, which, holds the sacred ground of those Canadian soldiers who fell in the war, and there is a war memorial for them and graves in South Africa. Yes, so Canada was part of the global British Empire, and by extension, it was a beneficiary of that empire. So you cannot say that Canada did not benefit from the British Empire's largesse. In fact, it did. And this is not to put shame onto Canada, but this is part of history. And part of history is about engaging with the truthfulness of that history instead of rewriting it or revising it. The next point is that the entire concept of the Bantustan. Before we had Bantustan, it was called reservations. Now, where did South Africa get that term reservations from? Well, it got that term from the British. It's the British who brought the term reservations to South Africa. And it brought the model that as you dealt in this particular way, as the British dealt with the indigenous people of Canada and the United States, they moved the indigenous people into reservations. Now, this is what the British tried to do in South Africa, to move the indigenous people into reservations. And those reservations eventually they became Bantustan. So British Empire had this remarkable ability to constantly divide people. And they constantly divide people. They would seek the differences that you belong to this tribe, you belong to that tribe, and you need to be put. So the British colonial system is based on demarcation and division. And they did the same thing in South Africa. And of course, in 1948, when the Nationalist Party came into power, they put that very system on steroids, and you became the Bantustans. But what we know, that the Bantustan became a site of struggle. It became a site of struggle where the indigenous people in those Bantustans were developing the skills to resist, developing the hope to resist. So Bantustans eventually, whilst they are designed to be places where you can concentrate a particular grouping of indigenous people, those Bantustans become a site of struggle. And I want to relate this, and I don't know why people have great difficulty now. I don't know why Israel has a particular problem in understanding that when you take people and put them concentrated either in Gaza or the West Bank, those people are going to resist. They're going to resist. And don't be shocked when they resist. And this is the thing that I simply cannot understand. Why is it that this happened? Now, in regard to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, yes, it is true. And I want to make the distinction between the Canadian government and the Canadian people. So the Canadian people, either in the trade union movement or in students or in the conscious entity within Canadian polity, were always supportive of the anti-apartheid struggle. And much of the support that was given to liberation movement came from Canadian people. And it's the work of the unions, fundamentally, the work of the unions that forced the Canadian government in the time of Brian Mulroney to then take the position that it took in regard to supporting the release of Nelson Mandela, in arguing for sanctions against apartheid South Africa because of its race-based policies. Of course, we're all hoping that that monumental and that courage that Brian Mulroney had in regard to South Africa, that other prime ministers will have that kind of courage in regard to Israel. And I think it should happen. And I think many countries should now join the call for sanctions against Israel, because fundamentally Israel is leading, and its conduct is leading to the breakdown of international law. And this is why all of us need to act against that. But let me just say that there is this duality in Canada. So much so that last year we honored unionists who played a role. We honored them in regard to giving them an award for their role in the anti-apartheid struggle. So I make the distinction between Canada and the Canadian government and the Canadian people. And lastly, I must say that the IDRC, which is the International Development Research Center, played an enormous role. It's a crown entity, played an enormous role in, can you hear the noise? Someone's ringing the doorbell. Okay, it stopped. It played an enormous role in empowering us in the liberation movement in order to be able to negotiate and deal with complex issues as constitutional making, etc. So Canada played different roles in this period. And I think we need to have the courage to acknowledge these different roles that we played.
Ina, can you ask the next question?
Thank you so much for this very sobering information and reminder of the similarities that have taken place between Canada, South Africa, as well as in Palestine. So Israel used to be a close friend and ally to the South African apartheid regime in the 70s and 80s. And they've been implementing an apartheid on the Palestinian people for what I've learned is almost 8 decades. How do you see the similarities between both of those regimes?
Yes, and there are 2 points I want to make on this particular matter, but I just get lost in my thoughts. So if I slip off from the topic, remind me to come back to it. The first point I do want to make is that the incredible number of people who identify themselves as Jewish that were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, an incredible number. And I think if you take it per population, per 1,000 of population, then those who identified themselves as Jewish, who were identified as Jewish, played an incredible role in the anti-apartheid struggle. And yeah, I'm thinking about Root First. I'm thinking of Joe Slovo. And when I talk about playing roles, not just to the intellectual roles of the anti-apartheid struggle, but in hardcore military roles. And this has always been an incredible source of solidarity for us. Secondly, the apartheid government and the Palestinian government are incredibly similar. The National Party came into power in 1948. Israel was established as a Jewish state in 1948. Both of them claim that they are chosen people. The apartheid government had a clause that says, marry not your people to the tribe of the Canaanites. And because of that, they would argue that God intended to keep the races separate. So too does Israel in terms of its Amalek teachings and Amalek discourses. Somehow seems to relate the discriminatory, racially discriminatory politics based on some kind of religious texts. But in both cases, we found that I find that interpretation, that very narrow interpretation of holy texts is actually incorrect. And there are others in both sides of, in the apartheid regime and now in the Israeli regime, who would argue that this is the incorrect interpretation of holy texts. All the approaches to deal with dissent are the same. In the apartheid regime, you deal with dissent, but not understanding the nature of the dissent. You deal with dissent militarily. In Israel case, how do you deal with the Palestinians' demand for a Palestinian state? Well, you deal with it militarily. So the use of violence was a common feature in both, and it is a common feature in the case of apartheid South Africa, and now it is a dominant feature. In respect of apartheid South Africa had the notion that in order to protect apartheid, they needed to extend the borders of apartheid. So apartheid government bombed every country in the region. It bombed Angola, it bombed Zimbabwe, it bombed Botswana, it bombed Lesotho, it bombed Mozambique, and Israel does the same. It bombs Lebanon, it bombs Syria, it bombs anywhere and everywhere they think there is someone there to harm them, they bomb them. They will also be similar in one other way. Violence cannot exist forever. And just as the apartheid government imploded, so too will the Israeli government implode, because these contradictions cannot be maintained forever. So, yes, there are great similarities, and yes, there were great friendships, and yes, they both saw themselves, the apartheid regime saw themselves as a white enclave surrounded by indigenous people, and they had to protect themselves. Well, Israel sees themselves surrounded by Arab people that they call the other, and that they have to deal with the other. And that's why South Africa used to claim, apartheid South Africa used to claim that it was the only democracy in Africa. And Israel makes the same claim that it is the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, the fundamental problem with that claim is that democracies is not only about voting. Democracies is about the nature and the content of your democratic order, and whether your democratic order advances humanity, advances human values, advances development, not for people who look like you, not for the people who are in your same religion, but for all of the people that that reside in your country. Now, certainly, for the Arab citizens of Israel, it is not like that. So the bad news I have for Israel is that all that has happened to apartheid South Africa will one day happen to it. One day they would have to negotiate. One day they're going to have to agree about power sharing. They're going to have to agree on the establishment of two-state. The only thing that we are saying, why should that one day wait for another 7 decades? It could be tomorrow. If you truly accept that you want to be at peace with your neighbor, then start talking to your neighbor, and talk to your neighbor not as a beneficiary of your largesse. Talk to your neighbor equally as a human being so that you could resolve your problems through political dialogue and negotiations. So that would be my answer to that question.
Elizabeth, you can go ahead with your question.
Okay, the last question is in regards to the case that South Africa had submitted accusing Israel of committing genocide. And recently, a decision had come out from the International Court of Justice regarding that case. And when it came out, it seemed like it was a win, but is it really? Because this case was accusing Israel of committing genocide. And I think for most of us, it clearly was. And as a mother, it's been very difficult to watch the horrific and unimaginable torturing and killing of children and babies every day for over a year now. And I think for anyone that have seen what's happening, you cannot remove those images out of your head. And it makes me so angry that South Africa had to even prove the intent. The intent of those actions was to establish a genocide. And Netanyahu has repeatedly made comments about what his intent is. So I don't know how much clearer it can be. And the ICJ made a decision with a number of orders, but Israel is violating the orders of the ICJ. And at the end of the day, we have all seen, no matter what happens, Israel has not abided by those rulings, and they have no plans to stop. And 14 countries have joined the case now in support of South Africa. So what is the next steps, and how is the ICJ or the UN holding Israel accountable?
Elizabeth, that is a fantastic question. And, you know, I must say, I too watch every day. And because of the time zone differences between South Africa and Canada, I find that I'm normally up at 2 a.m. in the morning watching Al Jazeera as I'm taking in all the information that I get from there. So let me give you the situation of South Africa, apartheid South Africa. You'll recall that the International Criminal Court ruled that apartheid was a crime against humanity. We had resolution after resolution taken in the United Nations, and for every one of them, apartheid government violated. Until its violations came to such a point where no other country, and no country who claims to be reasonably minded, could now accept that impunity of apartheid South Africa. I referred to the matter of Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney was a conservative. And the Conservative Party were very supportive of apartheid South Africa until Brian Mulroney said, enough, no more, no more. And then he started to engage with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and there was a huge battle amongst them, but he was insistent that the Commonwealth must take a decision that removes apartheid South Africa from it. I think that this momentum against the impunity of Israel is happening because no state can exist in isolation of the international community. Israel is not self-sufficient. It exists on the largest of the United States of America. It exists on the largest of Canada. It exists on the largest of Germany in the main. 99.9% of the weapons that go into Israel comes from the United States and come from Germany. Now, it's clear to me we are reaching a tipping point in which international law will be brought to bear on Israel, simply not because many of these countries would want it, but because of the impunity by which Israel is violating international law, and that threatens these countries. Let me quite give you a real example. I'm going to be very provocative here. What is stopping the indigenous people of Canada today to rise up against colonial settlement in Canada? Nothing. They can do so now because of the impunity and the breakdown of the international legal system. So this matter of the impunity of Israel is going to be affecting every country in the world. And this is why governments who normally would, they would be hypocritical in their approaches will now be ready to say, no, we've got to call in sanctions, we've got to call in issues. I mean, there is a UN resolution called the responsibility to protect by all means necessary. It was used in the case of Libya. It was used in the United Nations against Libya to bomb Libya because the argument was at that time that Gaddafi was going to be engaging in a horrible extermination of his people who disagree with him. Therefore, they moved in. So the instruments to stop Israel's genocidal activities exist. So I'm of the view that international law is moving to such a point and the momentum is gathering that Israel will indeed be isolated because of its actions of impunity. Because there is, after the judgment of the ICJ, beyond plausible to real genocide is coming. It's coming. And then you would have the warrants of arrest in respect of Netanyahu and Gallant. Now you'll have a ruling of the ICJ. You already have a ruling of the ICJ that says plausible genocide. Then you will have another ruling of the International Court that will say genocide. And the world cannot escape, can no longer then escape the fact that international law or institutions of international law has found against Israel. Now, countries who will then support Israel has to do so in a way that says you are supporting the violations of international law, you're supporting genocide, you can be held responsible. When class action suits are brought against those countries that is supporting genocidal action, you will fundamentally see a change. This is our experience in South Africa. This is how we felt it. For a long time, we felt incredibly isolated. For a long time, we felt, we even developed slogans. And one of the slogans was, "Black man, you're on your own." So I can see how the Palestinians can rise to that call to say, Palestinians, you're on your own. Well, when you are suffering that much, when you are dealing with such unbearable losses, it is understandable that people will come to that. But the truth is, they're not alone. And the absolute feature says they're not alone is that we are here. There is 64 of us today talking about this very matter. Tomorrow, there will be 600, and that is our task. How do we keep multiplying our numbers so that millions upon millions upon millions of people will say, not in our name, not one day more, not one more death. Israel must be brought to account for its actions. So please do not give up hope. Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Honorable Mr. Rieaz Shaik. I know you have to go elsewhere, so we're just gonna say just a few words of thank you. First, on the behalf of the Coalition of Racialized Workers of OPSEU SEFPO, and on the behalf of the Rainbow Alliance Arc-en-ciel, we really, really thank you. I also thank you from the bottom of my heart as a Palestinian who has family in the West Bank who are living right now under apartheid, who also from another person who grew up under occupation. Thank you so much for taking this out of your time in coming. We have a movie showing afterwards, but I'm going to give a little bit of a time. My colleagues, Elizabeth, Hilda, and Tina want to say something. Just I want to make a point that the Rainbow Alliance, the other committee, official committee of OPSEU we have here, they had a trip to South Africa recently, and they visited the island where Nelson Mandela was actually incarcerated. And, you know, they supported the Coalition of Racialized Workers here. Tina is a member of the Rainbow Alliance. I just want to see if Elizabeth and Tina, if you want to say a couple of words of thank you to the commissioner, same as Hilda, our staff member. The floor is yours.
Tina, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for being here today, and Alla for being the mastermind organizer who was able to put together an amazing and informative evening. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm sure it's not easy sharing those intimate details about your own personal life and what you have gone through over the course of the last few decades. So thank you so much for your knowledge and your passion and your fight.
I'm gonna go. Okay. I want to say thank you for being here and speaking to us. I was with Tina in South Africa, and when you talked about, you know, how what's happened there still is when we were down there, you can clearly see how it still affects the people. There is a big divide. It is very visible. But what I'm taking away from today is what you said about what unions did and how they played such a predominant role in affecting change. And I think that a lot of us, most I think here are union members, and I think we need to, you know, really push and stop, like not stop this, because I see in the Western world, maybe we are, you know, a lot of people are still not informed. And I think that has a lot to do with social media or whatever. But as union members, we this is what we do, and we need to be vocal. We're out on the streets every week, and we have to continue this work. So unions do have that power, and you told us today, you know, the power they had in making a difference in South Africa. So thank you so much for being here and sharing with us.
Thank you
Hilda,
very much.
Hilda, if you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you so much, High Commissioner Shaik, for gracing this occasion and for all the information that you've been able to provide. We are especially grateful for your passion and your fearlessness to articulate the issues that you've just addressed this evening, and also to say that OPSEU SEFPO has always been out there to stay alert on the struggle of the Palestinian peoples, and that's how we have the Coalition of Racialized Workers and other equity committees that are mandated within the OPSEU Constitution to be able to bring to the foresight and to the limelight such kind of equity issues, and particularly the issues that impact humanity, and Palestinian is one issue that is very dear to all of us, and it's not easy, it's very divisive, but at the same time, it's a matter that needs to be addressed. And so we thank you so much for being here with us today, and we'll continue engaging and expecting that our Coalition of Racialized Workers and other equity committees within OPSEU will continue to give these events and to be able to really put a spotlight on what's happening in the Palestinian and the Israeli conflict. So we thank you once again, and we look forward to probably having you sometime in future, and we are really honored to have you with us. We would have wanted our union president to be present, but she had other engagements, and so we are all together in this, and we really welcome you and hope that you can continue to engage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. It was really a pleasure. You unions and NGOs have free access to me. Allah's got all the details, so please don't hesitate. I will always avail myself. And yeah, I mean, I just think that we cannot keep silent. We cannot keep silent. We've got to organize in the union, in the factory floors, raise the consciousness of the world so that we could give to the generation that comes a better world. Thank you so much. I will go to my next event.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. Thank you so much. We hope to see you again. Thank you again for
Bye-bye, everyone.
time. Thank you.
Enjoy the movie. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you again to the High Commissioner. Just for everyone knows, the High Commissioner just volunteered his own time without any speaker fees, nothing. He just volunteers his own time. Okay, so we're exactly almost on schedule, 5 minutes behind. So the High Commissioner has put just so many things in perspective, and he tried to paint a picture there. What we're going to do right